Hey there, ready to dive into some truly fascinating history? Today we're exploring The Splendid and the Vile by Erik Larson. It chronicles Winston Churchill's first year as Prime Minister during World War II, May 1940 to May 1941, and let me tell you, it's not your typical dry history book.
It's more like stepping into a time machine. Larson goes beyond the political battles and war strategies, offering this intimate glimpse into Churchill's daily life amidst the Blitz. He draws on personal diaries, private letters, sources most people wouldn't even know existed.
Right, like we all know Churchill as this iconic wartime leader, but to think about him facing family dramas, financial woes, even hating whistling as much as he hated Hitler, it makes history feel so much more real and relatable.
What's fascinating is how Larson sets the stage. May 1940. Britain is on edge, France is crumbling, the threat of a German invasion is terrifyingly real, and the evacuation at Dunkirk is underway. This wasn't some distant historical event, it was their present, their stark reality.
And in walks Churchill, this figure who wasn't universally loved at the time. The book mentions King George VI having reservations, and even some American officials like Harold Ikes questioning his age and reliability. It wasn't a given that he'd become this unifying force we remember him as.
Absolutely, and Larson doesn't shy away from that. He paints a picture of a leader facing immense pressure, doubts from his own government, skepticism from international figures like Roosevelt, not to mention the weight of a nation on his shoulders.
And as if the looming threat of invasion wasn't enough, he had personal anxieties too. Larson reveals that Churchill was battling serious debt, which adds another layer of tension to his story. Can you imagine juggling national crises alongside personal financial ruin? I'd be reaching for the whiskey and soda myself.
And then there was his son, Randolph, who seemed determined to add to the chaos. His extravagant spending, gambling debts, the scandals. It's almost unbelievable how much drama unfolded within the walls of 10 Downing Street.
Okay, we have to talk about the whistling thing. Apparently, Churchill considered it on par with his hatred for Hitler. I mean, what does that tell you about the man?
This seemingly insignificant detail reveals so much about his personality. The intensity, the need for control, perhaps even a way of coping with the immense pressure by focusing on minor annoyances. It's a reminder that even amidst global crises, these were real people with their own quirks and anxieties.
It makes you wonder, right? How did they function, let alone lead under such immense pressure? Speaking of which, the book doesn't just focus on Churchill. It gives us this fascinating glimpse into the lives of his family during the war, and it's not always pretty.
It's true. Clementine, his wife, comes across as incredibly strong, supportive, yet dealing with the weight of her husband's burdens alongside those of a rebellious son. Imagine being the glue holding everything together while bombs are literally raining down around you.
And their daughter, Mary, was just a teenager when all this unfolded. Larson portrays her as witnessing firsthand the war's impact, going from a carefree youth to seeing her father bear the weight of the world. Talk about a crash course in growing up.
It's this coming-of-age story woven into a larger historical narrative. You have Mary experiencing the exhilaration and uncertainty of first love, while simultaneously facing the fear and danger of nightly air raids.
And then there's this other fascinating character, Churchill's scientific advisor, Frederick Lindemann. Larson describes him as this controversial figure, but someone Churchill fiercely defended, even shouting in Parliament, "Don't you know that he is one of my oldest and greatest friends?" That speaks volumes about their bond.
It does, and what's intriguing about Lindemann is his influence on Churchill's thinking. He wasn't afraid to challenge conventions, and that resonated with Churchill, who valued his unique, even if controversial, perspective.
This was also a time of rapid technological advancement, particularly in warfare. Larson details the discovery of German navigation beams, which threw a wrench into the RAF's strategy. They could no longer rely on darkness as a shield, which must have been terrifying.
Absolutely, because if the Luftwaffe could bomb accurately even in overcast weather or on moonless nights, it would change the game entirely. It highlighted the vulnerability of Britain's defenses and the very real possibility of a successful invasion.
It's amazing how Larson reveals the constant pressure cooker Churchill was living in. Even with the weight of the war on his shoulders, those personal financial woes never really went away, did they?
No, and it's almost hard to fathom. Here he is, leading a nation through its darkest hour, yet facing a massive personal debt payment that he simply couldn't cover. And of course, Randolph's antics weren't helping the situation.
Speaking of Randolph, Larson really peels back the layers on his character. Those constant demands for money, the gambling debts, the sheer talent for creating scandals. It's almost comical if it weren't so serious.
It really highlights the stark contrast between Churchill's public persona and his private life. Imagine the stress of making life or death decisions for a nation, knowing that at any moment another telegram could arrive detailing some new drama courtesy of your own flesh and blood.
I know we keep coming back to Randolph, but it's just such a train wreck you can't look away from. But in all seriousness, it makes you wonder how Churchill coped with that level of pressure on top of everything else.
While Larson sheds light on some of his coping mechanisms, Churchill was known for his late-night dictating sessions, often fueled by whiskey and cigars. He also surrounded himself with a dedicated team of secretaries who worked tirelessly to keep pace with his relentless energy. It seems like he needed to be constantly in motion, both physically and mentally.
And then there was Chequers, his country residence. It's depicted as this sanctuary, a place where he could escape the chaos of London and indulge in his love of painting, his pet goldfish. Simpler pleasures.
But even Chequers wasn't entirely an escape. The threat of air raids loomed over everything. Larson details the elaborate security measures in place: barbed wire, armed guards, even code words for potential invaders. It really emphasizes how the war permeated every aspect of their lives, even in moments of supposed respite.
It's almost jarring to picture this iconic figure worrying about blackout regulations or the placement of sandbags. It humanizes him in a way that's both relatable and deeply poignant.
Yeah, and as the Battle of Britain raged, Churchill found himself increasingly reliant on Franklin D. Roosevelt and the United States for support. It was a complex relationship fraught with its own set of challenges.
It's easy to forget that the U.S. wasn't officially in the war at this point. Roosevelt had to tread carefully, balancing his desire to help Britain with the need to appease a still largely isolationist American public.
Exactly. Larson reveals the delicate dance of diplomacy that was going on behind the scenes. Churchill, desperate for American aid, constantly pushing for more. Roosevelt trying to navigate the complexities of domestic politics while recognizing the vital importance of supporting Britain.
One of the key turning points, as Larson describes it, was the Lend-Lease Act in March 1941. This allowed the U.S. to provide essential war materials without demanding immediate payment. It was a lifeline for Britain, but it didn't come without conditions.
It's fascinating how Larson highlights that even during a global crisis, political maneuvering and self-interest were still very much in play. Roosevelt wasn't shy about using Lend-Lease's leverage to influence Churchill's decisions, particularly when it came to ensuring Britain could feed itself.
Imagine being in those rooms. The weight of these negotiations, the fate of nations hanging in the balance. And then they start discussing food rations. It's a stark reminder that even amidst extraordinary circumstances, the mundane aspects of life and politics still intrude.
And while Churchill was navigating the treacherous waters of international diplomacy, the family drama continued. Poor Clementine. She remained his rock, his confidant, but even her patience must have been tested by Randolph's antics.
The book mentions Pamela, Randolph's wife, having to appeal to Max Beaverbrook, Churchill's close friend and Minister of Aircraft Production, for financial assistance. She simply couldn't keep up with Randolph's extravagant spending.
It's almost Shakespearean, isn't it? This backdrop of war, of global significance, yet intertwined with these deeply personal, almost petty dramas playing out within Churchill's own family. It's these human elements that make the splendid and the vile so compelling.
Absolutely. And speaking of compelling subplots, there's Mary's story blossoming amidst the chaos. It's surprising in a way to see this romantic entanglement unfolding amid such turmoil.
It highlights that even in the darkest of times, life and love find a way. Mary's diary entries, which Larson weaves into the narrative, offer a unique perspective. Here she is, experiencing the universal uncertainties of first love, while simultaneously grappling with the very real possibility of her world crumbling around her.
And remember, she's living at Chequers, surrounded by her father's inner circle. Military strategists, politicians, even celebrities taking refuge from London. Talk about a coming-of-age story. It's easy to picture those lavish dinner parties, the hushed conversations about top-secret matters, then Mary retreating to her secluded bedroom on the third floor, accessible only by that secret spiral staircase Larson describes.
It sounds like something out of a movie, but it also underscores the juxtaposition that Larson captures so brilliantly throughout the book: the fear and the frivolity, the weight of responsibility, alongside the need for human connection and, dare I say, escapism.
And speaking of escapism, Larson also delves into the social scene in wartime London. It's fascinating how even with the constant threat of air raids, people still craved normalcy, connection, even a bit of fun.
It speaks to the resilience of the human spirit. People sought solace in familiar rituals, gathering at pubs, attending concerts, even finding love amidst the rubble. Larson vividly portrays this strange mix of fear and defiance that seemed to permeate life in wartime London.
As we head into the final chapters of The Splendid and the Vile, it really feels like things are coming to a head for Churchill personally and on the world stage.
Yeah, this is really where his strength as a leader, and honestly just as a person, is pushed to its limit. You've got the ever-present threat of a German invasion, the Battle of the Atlantic raging on, and of course his own personal struggles. Oh, and we can't forget about Randolph.
Speaking of, those stories about Randolph in North Africa, those escapades, almost hard to believe, really. It's like he was trying to see how much debt he could rack up, how many scandals he could create. How did Churchill manage all that family drama on top of a world war?
It really shows you how he could compartmentalize, to focus on what needed to be done no matter the chaos swirling around him. But Larson makes it clear it took a toll.
And as if things couldn't get more complicated, April 1941, Germany invades both Greece and Yugoslavia. You could practically feel that weight of responsibility on Churchill, those agonizing choices.
It's a real moral dilemma, isn't it? Wanting to help Greece, a nation fighting for its freedom. But strategically speaking, it was a gamble, stretching British forces even thinner.
Easy for us to judge with hindsight. But Larson pulls you into that moment, all the uncertainty, the impossible pressure on Churchill,
Yeah.
and the fallout after the Greek campaign failed. The criticism, the questions about his decisions, just adds another layer.
And then, of course, there's Stalin lurking in the background. Don't forget, the Nazi-Soviet pact was still in effect. So
Yeah.
Churchill's walking this diplomatic tightrope, trying to anticipate Stalin's next move, but deeply distrustful at the same time.
That whole business with Stafford Cripps, Churchill's man in Moscow, it's like something out of a spy thriller. Cripps goes with a personal message for Stalin from Churchill himself, but, and people still debate this, he never actually delivers it. Imagine those hushed conversations, the fate of nations hanging in the balance, and then nothing.
Shows the challenges they faced back then. Communication during wartime, relying on go-betweens who might not be reliable, that constant fear of misinformation. And with someone like Stalin, the stakes couldn't be higher.
And in the middle of all this global turmoil, Larson brings us back to London, where Clementine really steps up. She makes it her mission to visit those London bomb shelters, and she's appalled by what she sees. Overcrowding, terrible sanitation, just a lack of basic necessities. It's a side of the home front we rarely hear about.
Really says a lot about Clementine. She wasn't content to just be the supportive wife at home. She saw a problem, and she confronted her husband, the prime minister no less, about it.
The book talks about how she wrote this scathing report, detailed her observations, urged him to act. She even suggested getting rid of that middle bunk in the shelters, those triple bunks, to improve ventilation and give people more space.
Such a small detail, but it sticks with you. This practical advice amidst these huge pronouncements and war plans. And clearly Churchill listened, because he did order improvements to those shelters.
Speaks to their relationship, don't you think? That trust, even when they disagreed. But just as one crisis is dealt with, another one rears its ugly head, that ever-present threat of invasion.
May 1941, Churchill orders this massive military exercise, codenamed Tiger. It was meant to test Britain's defenses against invasion. Larson describes it as this incredibly realistic simulation of a German landing on the south coast. Thousands of troops, live ammunition, the whole shebang.
I can only imagine how tense it must have been. That nagging thought in the back of everyone's minds. What if this isn't just practice? What if the next landing is the real deal?
And as if things couldn't get any weirder, on the night of May 10th, Rudolf Hess, Hitler's right-hand man, decides to take matters into his own hands.
The Hess incident. Talk about strange. This high-ranking Nazi flies solo to Scotland in a fighter plane, claiming he wants to negotiate peace. Larson does a fantastic job of capturing that sense of utter disbelief everyone felt.
At first, Churchill thought Hess had lost it, gone mad. But as more information came to light, the whole thing just got more and more bizarre. Hess refused to speak to anyone except the Duke of Hamilton, the Scottish nobleman. Talk about a diplomatic headache for Churchill. He couldn't exactly ignore Hess, but he also couldn't be seen negotiating with the enemy.
And then, to make matters even worse, Hitler publicly denounces Hess as a madman acting on his own. What a mess. It's no wonder this event has fueled conspiracy theories for decades.
It's the perfect example of how Larson takes these almost unbelievable events and weaves them into the bigger picture. History, but with this touch of the absurd, the almost surreal.
Sadly, though, the Hess incident caused even more friction between Churchill and Max Beaverbrook. Beaverbrook, always the one to go against the grain, actually thought they should hear Hess out. Consider his peace offer.
Shows how complex their dynamic was. Two brilliant minds, clashing personalities, and a friendship pushed to the brink by the pressures of war. And as if to remind everyone that the war was far from over, just days after Hess's arrival, London was hit by its most devastating air raid of the entire Blitz.
The night of May 10th and 11th, 1941, Larson really lays it bare. The Luftwaffe went after those iconic landmarks. The Houses of Parliament, Buckingham Palace. The destruction is hard to even imagine, and hundreds of lives were lost. It's a sobering reminder that war has a very real human cost, even with all the politics and strategies.
And even in the midst of that devastation, we see these flickers of resilience, of humanity. Larson includes an entry from Mary's diary from that night she was at Chequers, where she talks about the rain of objects falling on the roof, those bright flashing blue lights of the incendiaries.
It's those personal accounts, those little details that make the splendid and the vile so incredibly impactful. We're not just reading about events, we're experiencing them through the eyes of the people who lived them.
And through it all, Churchill remained resolute. He addressed the nation, vowing that they would never surrender, that they would continue to fight against Nazi tyranny. And then, only a few weeks later, this seismic shift in the war. Hitler breaks the Nazi-Soviet pact and invades the Soviet Union.
June 22nd, 1941. It's almost impossible to grasp the magnitude of that betrayal, the sheer audacity of Hitler's gamble. For Churchill, it was a whole new game, new alliances to forge, new threats to handle.
The Splendid and the Vile leaves us right at that turning point. Churchill, facing an uncertain future, knowing the road ahead will be long and difficult, yet still shouldering the hopes of a nation.
It's a powerful reminder that history isn't just dates and battles. It's woven together from individual stories, from triumphs and tragedies, even those unexpected moments of humor that remind us we're all human.
If you want a book that makes history come alive, that puts you right there in the thick of it with Churchill, walking those bombed-out London streets, or sharing a late-night whiskey in the cabinet war rooms, The Splendid and the Vile is it. Don't miss it.
Couldn't have said it better myself. And for our listeners, we've got a special link down in the episode description where you can grab your own copy and take that deep dive into this extraordinary time in history. Until next time, keep exploring, and we'll be here to guide you through the most fascinating corners of the past.